Windows on the World live every Sunday 9 to 11 p.m. GMT. Check out our archive and program stream at windowsontheworld.net. Good evening everybody, welcome to Windows on the World. And quite a busy couple of weeks I've been having, so tonight we might not have time for Common Law Malcolm, but I promise you that he's going to be back next week with more on the Magna Carta and standing under common law. Well, hope you're all protesting out there, and I hope you're all resisting the global action plan. But tonight we're going to be talking about, when does propaganda backfire? Well, it backfires when it's over the target and rather than over the top. And a lot of the propaganda we see at the moment is very just over the top rather than over the target, which is quite interesting. And we're going to get into that a bit more tonight. The term information warfare has become a bit sad though, hasn't it? I mean, what we are getting back for the fight back against the anti-vaxxers and the anti-maskers, it's not too good, is it? Which is quite encouraging and also quite comedic in itself. But the obvious is too obvious. What happens when the obvious is too obvious? Yeah, the arguments and ad hominems given over to the public by the hive mind are just not too good at the moment. It seems our show, though, is not one of the promoted anti-globalist shows. Now, this is quite interesting because I've found that recently, looking at the sort of reach that the show has, that we are blocked, and I didn't realise to what extent we were actually blocked until I started looking. And yes, it's not just Facebook, but just about everywhere else. So Windows on the World is one of the most blocked shows on the internet. I was quite surprised. I thought, no, I'm just getting paranoid. But when I actually looked into it, indeed, we are. So maybe, just maybe, and I think this is probably true, we are over the target. Yes, it seems our show is not one of the promoted anti-globalist shows, because things which do not actually really challenge the current situation are certainly allowed, and we see a lot of that. In fact, the globalists do need the anti-globalists to implement their policies, and the anti-globalists, of which we see protesting and requesting their freedoms back, when in fact they never had freedom but only liberty, are all part of the global action plan, as we've discussed. In actual fact, people who protest are actually enabling part of what's coming in, and people go, well, how can that be? Well, because protest is built into the system. What we need really to make a real change are disruptors. We hear that word quite a lot, don't we? Disruptors. In fact, if you look at lists of public speakers now, especially the ones that are backed by the United Nations and, of course, the general communitarian rollout, they often call them disruptors, and quite an interesting term that is. I think, and I have thought for quite some time, that the best way around this is actually usurp the narrative. In other words, with this communitarian system, what you have to do is usurp it and actually take it over. Everything's infiltration these days. And what about infiltrating the system, the communitarian system, and taking it over using its own terminology? Done quite a lot of shows on that over the last few weeks. Do have a listen to the back catalogue. Some of the stuff we're putting out, I really do believe is very cutting edge, because what's actually happening is we're taking some ideas from people who are actually making things work, a bit like the People's Rights Group in the United States. We did a show a couple of weeks ago with Casey Whalen of peoplesrights.org, which is banned on Facebook, also featuring Ammon Bundy, the famous Bundy Ranch standoff. I mean, we've been through all that in the last few shows, so we don't need to go into that anymore. But what I would say is that these are gems and pearls of wisdom from these people. And yes, you cannot have community rights. You can only have individual rights as part of a community. Just think about that, because the communitarian system means the hive mind, which means that it's really selfish of you not to get that vaccine or wear that mask. Again, the community rights usurping individual rights. Well, only individual rights can be considered to be real community rights. So yes, it does seem our show is not one of the promoted anti-globalist shows, which is great in some ways. But what about all the fruits of the labours of the past 10 years? Well, that's plain to see when we look at the quality of the people who actually listen to the show. The quality of people who listen to Windows on the World is quite incredible. And over the past 2 weeks, I've just been meeting a few people all over the place, all around the country, and I found that even private meetings are infiltrated by change agents. Would you believe it? You go for a strategy meeting, and out of the blue and out of nowhere, these people crop up who bring in the most childish arguments. Arguments such as, why is it us and them? Are these people 3 years old? Do they know nothing about the global governance system? Well, yes and yes. And people who don't have the ability to actually define what a fact is. Now, that is quite an astonishing thing, because we do live in a post-truth world. So those people who follow the Global Action Plan, as in globalist protest groups such as Extinction Rebellion, they come out with these kind of terms because they've been given them by the founders of these organisations, such as Gail Bradbrook, who studied social change theory. Now, social change theory is nothing to do with real social change. It's actually about what we're talking about at the beginning of the show, the disruptors, the people who jump in with their change theory, which is basically enforcing a consensus on the masses. But we are definitely blocked, even by the so-called anti-globalists. So it came as no shock to me, but I was quite surprised as to how much Windows on the World was actually blocked. But the term counterintelligence, now counterintelligence is an interesting term, isn't it? Not many people actually understand what it means, because in counterintelligence, what the state can do is actually give people 70% of what they want to hear. Now, I'm not going to name a particular station that does that. There are quite a few, but one particularly in the UK, which I've followed for 10 years, and I know a lot about, and also I know a lot of the casualties. In other words, the people who followed these fake remedy gurus and people who've led them nowhere. The counterintelligence idea is that you give the audience, in some ways, this is part of counterintelligence, by the way, they give the audience what they want to hear. So they think that you are reinforcing their narrative and actually doing some good. In other words, you are part of the resistance, when in fact you're telling people what they already know, and 30% of the 100% that goes out is absolute misinformation. So they will push people who are absolutely ridiculous, who will discredit you. Discreditation by association, that's a big thing. And I've studied all this for a long time. I find it quite fascinating, actually, but it's extremely limited. So it's the ad hominem attack, the usual logical fallacies. I suppose you think Elvis lives on the dark side of the moon, don't you? That sort of thing. But yeah, things have become steadily less sophisticated. But tonight we're going to look at different aspects of this and recap a bit on some of the things that I've been putting out over the past few years, and even in some of the talks that we've been doing. And I did refer to this quote a few weeks ago as to how this new Sustainable Development Agenda 21, Agenda 2030 Sustainable Development System actually came about. Well, our common future in 1987, we used that as a sort of meme the other week, actually, on our YouTube video of the show. Our Common Future came out in 1987, and it was really where they defined what sustainable development and the new communitarian system was actually about. And one of the questions raised in that document, which was also known as the Brundtland Report, it came out of the Brundtland Report. Gro Harlem Brundtland was, of course, well, not of course, you might not know, she was mentored by Edmund de Rothschild, Stephen Rockefeller, and the sort of steering groups for Agenda 21, which could be the Club of Rome, the Bilderberg Group, the Atlantic Council. There's loads of them, isn't there? You could go on all day. And I think we have done in the past, so I'm not going to do that now. But Our Common Future in 1987 asked the question, how are individuals in the real world to be persuaded or made to act in the common interest? Yes, for the common good, in the common interest, in the public interest, the common interest, the common good. These terms have been hijacked to mean the hive mind of totalitarianism. It went on and said the answer lies partly in education, institutional development, and law enforcement. That's quite revealing, isn't it? They also said most important, effective participation in decision-making processes by local communities can help them articulate and effectively enforce the common interest. Well, we are seeing the fruits of all that work at this very moment. Enforcement of the common interest. Yes, the whole idea of people walking around in masks was to test compliance and also to test out the new artificial intelligence systems and the new cameras. Of course, we now have cameras which can read people's faces who are wearing masks. We have the biometric ID system, which we've talked about. We have the social credit system. We have the global health security system. All this is what these people were talking about in 1987. And actually, they were talking about it from the early to mid-70s onwards. Look at organisations such as Earth First, who wanted to reduce the world population to about 1 billion or less. In fact, it was less than that. And Earth First are still around, as are organisations such as Client Earth, who bring court cases against what they call globalist corporations, which are actually not globalist corporations, but the way that governance works is lost on a lot of the people who are in the so-called anti-globalist movements. They don't get it at all. They will never understand that the oil industry created global warming. They just don't get it at all. But it's said in Our Common Future the changes in human attitudes that we call for depend on a vast campaign of education, debate and public participation. That's communitarianism, folks. A vast campaign of education, meaning indoctrination, debate, meaning Delphi technique, which is where all debate is controlled, and public participation, which means pointless shows of public participation, as in citizens' assemblies, where everyone is steered into the outcome. So we are now seeing the direct result of all that. It carried on. We cannot discuss environment or development without discussing political development. So everything is politicised. Everything has to be a cause. There must be more redistribution of power. Well, that sounds good, doesn't it? But what they mean by that is the citizens' groups taking direct action. Another aspect of Our Common Future, which is something we're seeing now and we've been hearing for the past 30 years, was ensuring a sustainable level of population, of course, population reduction, reorientating technology and managing risk, meaning smart cities, surveillance, data gathering, merging environment and economics in decision making. Well, a corporate land grab. We've seen a lot of that. We are aware that such a reorientation on a continuing basis is simply beyond the reach of present decision-making structures and institutional arrangements. It is with this in mind that we call for the UN General Assembly to transform this report into a UN programme on sustainable development. Those two words, which people think are very benign, but actually are meaningless, but also mean everything. In other words, population reduction, control and management of all assets, people and property. And we're seeing that now. If we look at this Canadian whistleblowers document, it was a Canadian MP, and it laid out what was actually happening at the moment and how they were going to do it. It's really, really a fascinating document. And it seems to mirror exactly what's going on. So yes, we are actually working to a script, and a very tight script, but it did say halfway through this document there would be a complete and total secondary lockdown, much stricter than the first and second rolling phase restrictions. Well, I don't know about you, but I've moved from tier 2 to tier 4 in a day. It's like crossing different time zones, but what's weird about it is everything stays the same. That's strange, isn't it? Well, not really, because there are no roadblocks. People are just doing what they want. There is less traffic on the road because people are watching television. But apart from that, well, what have we got? We've got people complying with masks in most places, not complying with them to the extent that the powers that be would wish. So that's quite interesting, because the mask is merely a sign to the surveillance system and the cameras as to how many people are taking part in the global action plan, how many people are giving into it. Yeah, it said that this was expected by the end of December 2020, complete and total secondary lockdown, and it will carry on into early January 2021. Well, have a listen to the useful idiot Mark Drakeford, who's locked down Wales. Wales seems to want to be locked down. They seem to be revelling it. If you look at the communitarian press, such as the Live group, just read it and weep. It's amusing, but it's also very tragic. In other words, well, the sooner we get the vaccination, the sooner we can go back to normal. Why are people being so selfish by going out? I've been locked down for months. I haven't seen my family. Why should they? Etc., etc. Big communitarian, big society totalitarianism being enforced by the public on the public, which was the whole idea of this system. That's exactly what it's about. Yes, reform and expansion of the unemployment programme to be transitioned into the universal basic income programme expected by the first quarter of 2021. Well, how many people are now on universal basic income? Social credit, that thing that we have been told about for a long time that we're all meant to go on. Well, it's quite a lot. Just check the figures out. It's a lot more than you think. It says here, projected COVID-19 mutation and or co-infection with secondary virus, referred to as COVID-21, leading to a third wave with much higher mortality and a higher rate of infection. Well, just read testing and falsifying death certificates for that. They've been doing that all year. But that is interesting, isn't it? So in other words, they're now talking about a mutation. Well, all viruses mutate if in fact they do exist, which is debatable, but all of these things do mutate. Of course, that's what's traditionally happened in the traditional story of all this. It says here, daily new cases of COVID-21 hospitalizations and COVID-19 and COVID-21 related deaths will exceed medical care facilities capacity expected in the first to second quarter of 2021. Enhanced lockdown restrictions, referred to as the third lockdown, will be implemented. Full travel restrictions will be imposed, including inter-province and inter-city, expected in the second quarter of 2021. So if you want to go and visit somebody, go and do it now. Well, are we really going to have these rolling roadblocks? Well, it would seem to be, according to what they're saying here. Transitioning of individuals into the universal basic income programme expected mid-2021. Projected supply chain breakdowns, inventory shortages, large economic instability expected late second quarter 2021. Deployment of military personnel into major metropolitan areas as well as all major roadways to establish travel checkpoints. restrict travel and movement, provide logistical support to the area expected by the third quarter of 2021. So it doesn't look as though there's going to be a let up, and it doesn't look as though we're going to go back to any sort of normal. So let's just see if this ties in with Your Global Neighbourhood, which came out in 1996. It is our firm conclusion that the United Nations must continue to play a central role in global governance. With its universality, it is the only forum where the governments of the world come together on an equal footing and on a regular basis to try to resolve the world's most pressing problems. Isn't it great that we've got them? Every effort must be made to give it the credibility and resources it requires to fulfill its responsibilities. Well, one thing it doesn't have is credibility, of course. The UN has no credibility whatsoever. But did you know that the World Government Summit of 2019 actually stated each year the summit sets the agenda for the next generation of governments, focusing on how they can harness innovation and technology to solve universal challenges facing humanity? Well, we've been seeing the whole of this being played out. And remember that the whole of the big society came out in 2010 in the UK and, of course, in America. And that's where we started to see the Saul Alinsky rules for radicals being used against the public rather than in the public interest. These rules for radicals can be used in the public interest. Go back to our last few shows on empowering your community. Have a look at that article on windowsontheworld.net, empowering your community. Really is the way forward, in my humble opinion. But it's not my opinion. It's actually the strategy of global governance taken apart. And who on earth in the UK is doing that apart from us? And of course you, the listener. Remember this from Big Society Change Agents, our article, which came out years ago on windowsontheworld.net. This is actually a quote from the Big Society Public Administration Committee Contents, March 2011. This was actually read out in Parliament. It said, impact and consequences of reductions. The impact of reductions will be one of anger, the degree of which is yet to be realised. As the reality of reduced services hit, people will rise to take action. The key to big society succeeding is to galvanise this energy. That is exactly what community organising and communitarianism is all about. That's what your global action plan, your global to local action plan is all about. And of course, they have been training these people in your local authority and in central government for the past 10 years. Of course, they've always been puppets, but it's a different way of training for the puppets. And we can see that. Turn on the television. They're all talking this new language of communitarianism. They're all saying no one will be left behind, straight out of the United Nations Agenda 2030 documentation. Have you ever heard of Crown Agents, incidentally? Crown Agents, do you know what they are? They work with public, private, NGOs, civil society. They work in over 100 countries and they're stakeholders in client nations. And they say, our consultancy work helps nations achieve deep-rooted change, the C word there, in the institutions and systems that are vital for nations' prosperity and well-being, the common good, of course. We work with governments, NGOs, public and private sector organisations to develop successful leaders and effective organisations through training and professional development programmes. Oh yes, your useful idiots locally are very well trained. So, what does this mean? It means that the key to taking back the power is local. Have a look again at peoplesrights.org in America. They are the only organisation which is directly challenging local officials. And guess what? Oh, they're far right. And do you know what? Do you know what happened when they demonstrated outside the houses of local corrupt government officials while they were on their Zoom calls? Well, one of them started crying and said she'd left her 12-year-old son at home, which is in itself questionable. But she was crying because her 12-year-old son might be upset by 3 people outside her house. And then, of course, they linked this group, People's Rights, to guess what? Oh, there's been some vandalism at an Anne Frank memorial. How original is that? That's original, isn't it? Now, that never seems to happen when we get people going against the globalists, does it? We never seem to actually run out of the same story. Yes, well, we've covered a few things so far, but do look at that Canadian government whistleblower document, the World Debt Reset Programme, because this was in the second part of that document. And this is what they're calling it, the World Debt Reset Programme. This is what's coming. This is why you have to go back to some kind of small sovereign groups. And small sovereign groups can have an enormous amount of impact because well-organised cells of a few people can become, guess what? Disruptors in the new system of global governance. Yes, the artificial intelligence doesn't like unpredictability. Let's get back to this World Debt Reset Programme. In exchange for acceptance of this total debt forgiveness, the individual would forfeit ownership of any and all property and assets forever. This is what we have been talking about for the last 10 years. In other words, you will not own property. What do the World Economic Forum and the United Nations say? The World Economic Forum partnered, by the way, with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals in June 2019. So now we can see how it's all interlinked. There's just a few organisations running the show. Any agent of the United Nations is above international law. Did you know that? Have a look on the UN Charter of 1947. That's one of my favourites, by the way. You've probably heard that before if you listen to the show. It says here, though, the individual would also have to agree to partake in the COVID-19 and COVID-21 vaccination schedule. So, part of being stuck on government handouts for the rest of your life is participation in the Global Action Plan of COVID-19 vaccination, because once you do that, you consent to giving away your sovereignty. This is very important. It's all about consent. So they need your consent, and your consent is implied once you accept the benefit privileges of the state. I've always said this, and it goes back to this idea of sovereignty and being outside the system. If you're going to be outside the system, then you're going to have to be very honest, and you're going to have to be living by your word. Your word is going to have to be your bond. If your word isn't your bond, then what is the alternative? The alternative is to join the Global Action Plan with all the rest of the people who are shilling for the global governance system. In other words, if you compromise slightly, then you compromise wholly. This is such an important point. Once you compromise yourself slightly to this system, then you enable it and you become part of it. And we see that all the time. People who think that they know better are actually enforcing this stuff on those around them, even unconsciously, with terminology such as, well, we all have to do our bit, don't we? Why are we being so selfish? All this sort of stuff is what started the problem. But people don't seem to get it. The vaccination schedule, let's get back to that. It would provide the individual with unrestricted travel and unrestricted living, even under a full lockdown, through the use of photo identification referred to as the health pass. Well, all this stuff is being openly talked about. It's not a secret, is it? It's not a big conspiracy theory. So we have to now look at the legitimacy of protest. What are protests achieving? They're not discussing this stuff in any depth or detail, or even coming up with any useful memes. Shouting, stand up, take your freedoms back every Saturday is exactly what the state want you to do. You are, by making that statement, admitting that you are hopelessly enslaved. People who say they want their freedoms back are already hopelessly enslaved. So, yeah, having just returned, as I said at the beginning of the show, from a round trip and a strategy meeting, it does seem that the infiltrators of the communitarian system are indeed everywhere. That's the idea of communitarianism, the big society. the new global system. Everybody becomes a tool of the agenda. It was stated in 1969 that the churches would help to enforce the degeneration and assimilation of religion into the New World System. And the biggest participant in global governance and the Sustainable Development Goals is, yes, you guessed it, the Vatican. So that quote that I gave you, that the churches would help in degenerating and assimilating this new system, came from a lecture by Dr. Richard Day in 1969, also known as the New Barbarians. And we have a show called Social Engineers Then and Now. Do have a listen to that. It's got all the quotes in. You can still find these interviews. People talking about it. A fellow called Lawrence Dunnigan, who was there in 1969 at Mount Sinai Hospital when Dr. Richard Day, who worked for what became the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which was at the time Planned Parenthood, gave this speech which outlined really what became Agenda 21. Agenda 21 kind of rounded it up into this big global community. At the time, they were a bit more crude in 1969. It was sounding very totalitarian. But of course, Agenda 21 and Sustainable Development is totalitarianism. So, I suppose he was right. But ever since Vatican II, when the priesthood literally turned their backs on God and addressed the congregation, it has been a headlong slide into the new system by assimilation. The Vatican actually have a website called inclusivecapitalism.com. What are they doing talking about such things? Well, it contains all of the Sustainable Development Goals, yes, what some would call the whole Antichrist agenda, as you would expect. It says on this website, which is a Vatican website, inclusivecapitalism.com, we consider that inclusive capitalism is fundamentally about creating long-term value for stakeholders. The Vatican, talking about stakeholders, I thought they were working as a priesthood, an elect priesthood under God. So they have stakeholders, do they? I see. Businesses, investors, employees, customers, governments, and guess what? Oh, you're going to love this. Communities, guided by an approach that provides equality of opportunity, meaning, of course, poverty for all. For all people to pursue prosperity and quality of life, irrespective of criteria such as socio-economic background, gender, ethnicity, religion, or age. In other words, the global Pangea, the borderless world, the wilderness of the mind, the fourth world wilderness. We are in the fourth world now. This is, of course, the inclusive social credit system and global health security system driven by COVID-19. Equitable outcomes, it says, for those who have the same opportunities and seize them in the same way. In other words, global communism according to some, but a communitarian system according to the more knowledgeable. Global communitarian communism under a technocracy. It carries on. Fairness across generations, so that one generation does not overburden the planet or realise near-term benefits that incur long-term costs at the cost of future generations. Well, that's absolutely textbook from Agenda 21. We must not impinge on the ability of future generations to continue, which means that everything you do is measured. Everything you do is measured by your carbon footprint. Of course, you're made of carbon and you have footprints. So what could possibly go wrong? Does it mean they don't want you here? I think it does. The very definition the global cabal gave for sustainable development, exactly in a nutshell, on this Vatican website, where they're talking about equality and fairness and basically their form of what used to be called capitalism. It says fairness to those in society whose circumstances prevent them from full economic participation in the economy. Well, that's going to be everybody. Remember that all self-employment has been destroyed in little more than 9 months, and it's not going to stop now. Look at what's happened for Christmas. They were going to let you out for a few days. Now look, it's Tier 4. Tier 4 just means that small businesses and pubs and small venues go bust. That's all it means. That's what Tier 4 is all about. So, most of the planet already done, and we are only 8 months into the global coup. Let's see what else it says. Aspirations for systematic change. Read it and weep. Council members make actionable commitments aligned with the World Economic Forum International Business Council's pillars for sustainable value creation. Now, what are the Vatican doing using this terminology, and what are they doing aligning themselves with the World Economic Forum, which is a bunch of cabal globalists who most people, when they look at the World Economic Forum website, realise have nothing to do with anything religious or even anything to do with the betterment of the planet. What they want is the elite oligarchs running everything and slavery under a technocratic system using this big banner of global communitarianism. It says people, planet, principles of governance and prosperity, and things that advance the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which is, of course, population reduction and control and management. This is a declaration of opposition to all the genuine causes of the universal church. This definition of global governance and depopulation with techno-slavery for all is the new universal church of the Antichrist. Yeah, for those of a religious persuasion, that's exactly what it is. And don't think that any other religion is any different. And we all know, or most people with a functioning brain cell know, that certain sections of a certain religion want a different set of rules for the rest of the world. That's problematic. But by their own definition, they've reversed everything they purport to have stood for. It doesn't matter whether it's the Anglican Church or the Vatican. The universal church of inclusivity for the captives of earth under tyrants is supported by all. Well, not all, but the greater good. The consensus. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, is just another hand-picked subversive and weak-willed useful idiot for the technocrats. Have you heard him and the subversive things he's saying? Well, these people are the opposite of what they profess to be. They are global hypocrites. It says, though, here, economic growth must be inclusive. Oh, that's all right then, isn't it? As long as it's inclusive, to provide sustainable jobs and to promote equality. Well, of course, all this stuff about equality, gender equality, racial equality is merely there to divide and rule and use identity politics to drive groups apart. That's what it's there for. So when they talk about unity and diversity, the Unity and Diversity Council was set up to get people into a hive mind, but also to use divide and rule strategies. Again, the counterintelligence model. Yeah. Let's carry on with this. Principles of governance. They have a governing purpose. Well, of course they have a governing purpose. The World Economic Forum and the World Health Organization and the UN have a governing purpose. It says the equality of a governing body. Stakeholder engagement, the magic word, stakeholders. Look at your local council and look at the stakeholders. Whose stakes are they holding? Does it have anything to do with you? Nothing to do with you whatsoever. They talk about ethical behaviour, risk and opportunity oversight, prosperity, wealth creation and employment, innovation in better products and services, community and social viability. Do have a look at that website. It's well worth a look. Inclusivecapitalism.com. Read it and weep. But also learn about how all this stuff is interlinked, because that's the whole point of these shows. The interlinked nature of it all. Here's something I found about a week ago. It's from humansarefree.com. UN troll farm. 110,000 volunteers to push approved COVID-19 propaganda online and correct dissent. Well, they're not having much luck with this, really, despite having all of the social media platforms under control severely. It says UN Communications Director Melissa Fleming, like all of the UN personnel that are at those conferences, she's kind of dull and sinister at the same time, said that the volunteers would serve as a kind of digital first responders to online, quote, misinformation. The United Nations has announced that it has partnered with the World Economic Forum, the leader of the Great Reset, to promote a new campaign to control COVID-19 related discussion on social media. When you take into account the fact that the World Economic Forum is just basically a business lobbying group, or was to start with, and is now a global steering group, then it does start to sound a bit problematic. Who are these people to control the narrative of public opinion? Certainly, they can attempt to influence public opinion, but when they start taking it over, I think that's all we need to know, isn't it? It's a dystopian nightmare. In an interview for a World Economic Forum podcast, UN Communications Director Melissa Fleming highlighted the UN's hashtag Pledge to Pause initiative. Hashtag Pledge to Pause. It calls Pledge to Pause the first global behaviour change campaign on misinformation. Oh, this is straight out of the Ministry of Propaganda, isn't it? Well, literally. The first global behavioural change campaign on misinformation. What do you mean, misinformation? Oh, you mean the information which goes against the global corporate interests. I see. That sort of information. Oh, yeah. It was launched last month in collaboration with multiple NGOs backed by, you'll never guess who it's backed by, the multiple NGOs who backed this, the UN misinformation campaign. You'll never guess. Go on, I bet you will. George Soros and big tech companies. The programme seeks to mobilise experts and researchers, governments, influencers, civil society, businesses, regulators and the media to stop what the UN deems to be wrong information regarding COVID-19. It ultimately aims to reach a global audience of 1 billion, the UN has said. Well, that's handy, isn't it? Because the UN want the world population to go down to 1 billion. So that means 1 billion people who just believe the UN. Those must be the people that they want left when all the rest of us are gone. Now it's starting to make sense. Hashtag Pledge to Pause is part of a larger project called Verified, which recruits participants to spread, in quotes, verified content optimised for social sharing. Verified content optimised for social sharing, produced by the UN Communications Department. Melissa Fleming. I wonder if that Michael Ryan's got anything to do. You know, the one who actually said that he was going to drag people out of their houses if they might have a common cold. Remember that at the beginning of the pandemic? Well, yeah, he's a real subversive. All of these subversives hiding out in Switzerland, going to Davos, but never really engaging with the public. Have you seen any of these people on the street talking to the public, asking the public what they think? No, you haven't, have you? Well, wait a minute. Isn't that anti-communitarianism? No, it's not. It's just making sure that the globalists and the real anti-globalists do not meet face to face. It says the content is designed to be front and centre in your social media feeds, according to Melissa Fleming. She also has claimed that the United Nations is working with social media platforms to recommend changes to help break the chain of misinformation. Wow. Fleming told the World Economic Forum that hashtag Pledge to Pause and Verified have recruited, yes, listen to this, 110,000 information volunteers thus far. Do you mean they're volunteering? Like, you know, these volunteers for the United Nations who go and sort of get involved in their lobbying when they're on a sabbatical from either getting a job or finishing college. Is it those sort of people? I wonder if it is. She said, we equip these information volunteers with the kind of knowledge about how misinformation spreads and ask them to serve as digital first responders. She stated elsewhere that the UN has reached out to member states, UN media partners, celebrity supporters and businesses to help us disseminate to the millions we will need to reach with the campaign. The UN Communications Department runs Verified. in collaboration with purpose. Don't you just love the names of these organisations? Verified, purpose. They never have one called Truth, though, do they? I wonder why. Purpose, a left-wing activist group that boasts about partnerships with Google and the Gates Foundation. Wow. At least they're not funded by Uncle George, he says, tongue-in-cheek. In 2012, wow, that's quite a long time, isn't it? 2012, Purpose have been around a long time. They started a project called All Out, an LGBT movement that now claims nearly 2 million members and has joined in on recent attacks on Poland's pro-family law and culture. They're probably having a go at Hungary as this podcast goes out, because Hungary has been really attacked over this stuff, over the right to life. One of the organisation's founders has pushed for the EU to tie COVID-19 relief for Poland to capitulation on LGBT demands. You see how they push all these agendas together? In other words, if you like one thing, you've got to like the other. They're all interlinked. It's all part of the global governance system of mind control. A measure, it says, which the European Commission took up earlier in the month. So this is about a week or so old now. So we're talking about November, December 2020. The World Economic Forum and United Nations have worked together before to influence conversations on social media. Never. I never would have thought that, would you? In March, the World Economic Forum called on supporters to advance a campaign called #BeReady, which had backing from the World Health Organization and the World Economic Forum's activism network. Guess what? So the World Economic Forum have an activist network called the Global Shapers. What about the global shape shifters? That'd be interesting, wouldn't it? I wonder if they do. I wouldn't be surprised if Klaus Schwab actually does. Shapeshift, that is. It says there is no hierarchy to doing what's right. Oh, very communitarian statement. No one will be left behind with that one. The World Economic Forum said, encouraging people to circulate vetted business messages from the World Health Organization throughout their organizations. Talk about controlling the narrative. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, a long-time socialist and LGBT fanatic, delivered a speech at the Great Reset launch event calling for more equal, inclusive and sustainable economies. Where would they be without the word sustainable? Where would they be without it? They'd have to think of something else, wouldn't they? But I doubt they could. 2 months ago, the World Economic Forum hosted a summit on using the Great Reset as a vehicle for the realisation of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. The World Economic Forum had pledged last year to help implement the goals, which have been interpreted by UN agencies, including the World Health Organization, to encompass so-called abortion, in inverted commas, rights. #Pledge to Pause, verified, and the Great Reset follow a wave of anti-Christian persecution and media censorship during the COVID-19 crisis, which have ramped up in the wake of the contested US presidential election, which has gone very quiet but is still happening massive in the background. This is all very interesting because there is a seething underbelly. Everything now of any importance is actually underground. It actually functions in an underground way. In other words, outside of this ridiculous narrative that's promoted by all of these organisations who work together as one defining unit for global governance. It says here, in an open letter to President Trump, Archbishop Carlo Vigano described the United States as the defending wall against which the war declared by the advocates of globalism has been unleashed. Now, this is interesting, actually, because when you see some of these real church people, these real clergy, these real priesthood going against the World Economic Forum, the World Health Organization, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the cabal, it's quite interesting as to the language they use. And the language they use is pretty authentic. Worth looking up what especially is being said in Eastern Europe by the priesthood there, or the priest class, the self-appointed priest class, but at least they are not the self-appointed priest class from Davos. Yeah, well, if you look at people like Klaus Schwab, well, you could say James Bond villain, but I think it's worse than that. Now, this fella, Archbishop Carlo Vigano, he also urged that American Catholics can and must pray to stop such a massive deployment of adverse forces. I like the way he put that, actually, a massive deployment of adverse forces. Sounds a bit like the 7-7 Brigade, which comes out of Reading, Berkshire, trying to control the narrative on Facebook and Twitter. We actually did a bit of a comedy on that a few years ago, and you can find it on our YouTube channel while it's still there. It's called Facebook's UK Army Trolls. It doesn't come up in searches, unsurprisingly, because it's probably being blocked, but it was all about the incompetence of the Ministry of Defence in telling the public that they were engaging in psychological warfare against the public. Only the Ministry of Defence would do that. Yes, the so-called troll farms, though, in finishing off this section, are nothing new. They have been used before by branches of the government, including intelligence agencies and even police or various nefarious entities, to correct online discussion. Well, we have a lot of that, don't we? Fact checkers, anonymous, and sway opinions on matters such as the war on terror, vaccines, etc. Yes, these people can have multiple accounts, sometimes as many as 10. They spam discussion boards online, liking or voting up each other's comments while downvoting and ridiculing or trolling genuine people who disagree with the official narrative. Imagine what 110,000 people, sometimes with several accounts each, can do when they intervene in a coordinated manner on social media. Now, this is quite interesting, but how much influence does this really have? Because what I see when I do look at social media, when I look at the output of the communitarian press, especially the live group, I see a lot of dissent in those comments. And the comments which seem to be, or would appear to be, coming from these funded so-called groups are actually just cut and paste quotes from the likes of the United Nations, the World Health Organization, etc. They don't actually add anything to a conversation, and what they usually do is obviously try to bring in ad hominems. It says they can easily create the illusion that the majority of people hold an opinion that is favourable to the narrative. Well, that's exactly what they're trying to do, but is it working? Is it working? I don't know whether it is. But this is another aspect of it. British Army spies wage information war against anti-vax content online. It says, with a significant number of Britons sceptical of a COVID vaccine, the Army has reportedly deployed an information warfare unit to stamp out anti-vax propaganda online. Now, I haven't seen too much of this. I haven't seen too much of it being effective. Offline, which is what it's called, citizens still protest lockdowns in the streets, it says here. According to a report in the Sunday Times, ministers are preparing to launch a massive public information campaign to convince people to take the jab. Well, never. I mean, just turn on the telly or open a newspaper and you would think that it's a done deal. You would think that it had been tried and tested and it was ready to be rolled out. Well, newsflash, news just in, it's not actually tried and tested according to the UK government, until January 2023. That could be a bit of a problem. Have you seen the so-called fainting nurse video? There's quite a few of them. I mean, once you start scratching the surface with this, you'll find out that it doesn't look too safe at all. This does it really? Well, I'm not going to get into what's in it because I think we've covered that. But, putting stuff like that into people without properly testing it. Well, let's wait for the second wave, because that's what Bill Gates was already kind of warning us about and laughing and doing his duper's delight about, wasn't it? It says the media discovered that the 7-7 Brigade's speciality, according to a plaque on the wall of its Berkshire base, is creating behavioural change. With the rollout of a vaccine imminent, the unit is already monitoring cyberspace for COVID-19 content and analysing how British citizens are being targeted online, according to the Times. Now, this is quite interesting, actually, because it shows you that there's a problem. It shows you that even if the UN have got 110,000 of these trolls, even if there's 1,500 of them in Berkshire, they're not doing a very good job. So this is the problem with a hierarchical situation. If you go back to that article COVID protest social engineers. You'll see a video in that was done about 6 or 7 years ago when we were having these troll attacks then, and how kind of ineffective they are. And I think the idea of the disruptor, which is you, the listener out there, is to make this backfire on them. Make it backfire even through education. I think it's actually quite good fun, because the only real threat that we're facing is from the public. It's not really from the globalists. It's the public who are the ones who are going to enforce it. That's the whole idea of the communitarian agenda. So the public are the biggest enemy of you, the public. Yeah, I'm just going to finish off with this. This is quite interesting, actually. This is the case that was brought in the Portuguese court about the PCR test. Now, you may be familiar with this, but I think it's worth just extracting a few bits from this document. Basically, the provision was denied by the court. It says it means that if a person has a positive PCR test at a cycle threshold of 35 or higher, which is what they're using in the UK, as in most laboratories in the USA and Europe, it backs up by saying here, the chances of a person being infected are less than 3%. The probability of a person receiving a false positive is 97% or higher. I mean, this is outrageous, isn't it? Well, I think you, the listener, knows that already, but it says what follows from these studies is simple. The possible reliability of the PCR tests carried out depends from the outset on the threshold of amplification cycles that they contain, in such a way that up to the limit of 25 cycles, the reliability of the test will be about 70%. If 30 cycles are carried out, the degree of liability drops to 20%. If 35 cycles are reached, the degree of reliability will be 3%, which is exactly why they're doing it, to create cases. Cases create the COVID pandemic. However, in the present case, the number of amplification cycles with which PCR tests are carried out in Portugal, including the Azores and Madeira, is unknown, since we were unable to find any recommendation or limit in this regard. That means, basically, these private companies or whoever's rolling it out over there, their health system, they're not under any form of scrutiny or any form of management as to actually what they're doing or putting out. In other words, there's no golden rule. If there's no golden rule of law, then there's no law, is there? It says, in summary, COVID-19 tests show that false positives are increasingly likely in the current epidemiological climate scenario in the United Kingdom, with substantial consequences for the personal health and corporate systems. Thus, with so many scientific doubts expressed by experts in the field, which are the ones that matter here, as to the reliability of such tests, ignoring the parameters of their performance and there being no diagnosis by a doctor, very important that, isn't it, in the sense of the existence of infection and risk, it would never be possible for this court to determine that these are the people who were determined to have COVID-19 and they were actually quarantined. These people were quarantined, and the whole case was brought to see if these people were quarantined lawfully, and they're saying they weren't. It would never be possible for this court to determine that these people had the SARS-CoV-2 virus, nor that they had high-risk exposure. In summary, it will be said that since the appeal file is inadmissible due to lack of legitimacy and lack of interest in acting by the applicant, as well as manifestly unfounded, it will have to be rejected under the terms in the articles, it says here. It says, in view of the above and under the terms of Articles 417, number 6b and 420, both of the Penal Procedure Code, the appeal filed by the Regional Health Authority who brought it, represented by the Regional Health Directorate of the Autonomous Region of the Azores, is rejected. That is absolutely fascinating stuff, and that is something which should be quoted, because those PCR tests are dictating the amount of people who are infected with the mind virus. So it says having no legitimacy or interest. It's absolutely fascinating, that. Very good study. I hope that was all helpful. We're coming up to the hour. I'll be back on Friday, or should be back on Friday, which I believe is Christmas Day. It's the 25th, isn't it? And also we'll be hearing from Common Law Malcolm, and we'll be keeping up with the protests around the country. So until next week, stand up, take your freedoms back, but don't bother going out on Saturdays. Do some research instead and become a disruptor. That's it, everyone. Thanks and good night.